Good afternoon and happy Oktoberfest for this episode of Beer and Broadband. And
sorry, I was trying.
Like with any podcast, there's unexpected things that happen, just like cats. So, again, Beer and Broadband, a podcast by the people who love to bring broadband to communities, but enjoy slowing down to talk about things that keep us all connected. So we have an amazing guest today to talk through, and we've got some really fun topics from broadband expansion, funding, technology woes, and we're excited to get into it. And especially because it is Oktoberfest, we all have our beers. I have today a Pumpkinhead Ale from Shipyard. So let's jump right into it with introductions of the panel, and I'm going to start to my top left of my screen with Duke. Why don't you introduce yourself and who you're with?
Hey everybody, I'm Duke Horan and I'm president of Bonfire Engineering Construction. Today I also have my Oktoberfest beers. This is my favorite time of year for beers. I actually buy multiple cases every year so I can stock my fridge for the entire year with Oktoberfest. So when I just told Nick I wanted to be on the Oktoberfest, it's because I wanted to be on the Oktoberfest session because of the Oktoberfest beers that I can drink during the day.
Awesome. Well, welcome. And we'll go on down to my other left. Alex, want to introduce yourself?
I'm Alex Soderquist. I am Field Operations Manager for Fiber to Home for Boingo Wireless. And I am also doing the Sam Adams for Oktoberfest, one of my favorites. So looking forward to being here today.
Awesome. Welcome. And last, but certainly not least, a recurring guest on Beer and Broadband, Megan.
Yes, thank you for having me back. I'm Megan. I am the Director of Broadband Programs with Learn, Design, Apply. We are a grant consulting and management company. I don't have an Oktoberfest beer, but I have a pale ale called Baroness, which I felt was hopefully German enough, and my background is from the Austrian Alps, so
I like the virtual background. I like it. Very nice. Awesome. Well, welcome all of you guys. And as we always say in our past episodes, the purpose of this podcast is really to keep people informed and educated, but also to be entertained, which I think with this crew, we'll have a little bit of entertainment as we go. So let's jump right into it. Obviously, we're October, almost the end of the year. Hard to believe 2022 is coming to an end. It's been quite a year of broadband expansion. Would you guys agree?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
so many expansions just in our area, not to mention the fact that rural telecom is blowing up everywhere.
Yeah, I think if we think about the amount of activity that's happened in this year as a comparison to the last probably 10 years, it's probably pretty amazing. I guess the question for you guys are, what are you seeing that is working today and what's not working in this massive push to try to bridge that digital divide, create more digital equity? What's working, what's not from your perspectives?
Well, I think you kind of got to even take a step back before then, because 2022 has kind of become the year that we expected when COVID started. I've told people COVID was actually the best thing that could have happened to our industry, because it made so many people recognize that you could work remotely, and a lot of people had to work remotely, and some people had to go to school remotely. So the demand for fiber to the home became astronomically increased. It increased astronomically over the last couple of years, mostly because COVID drove it there, where sure, it was nice to have in the past, but it's become a bit more of a necessity. So 2022, from my perspective, we were still in the COVID hangover, and a lot of people weren't, the money wasn't flowing yet. But I think what we've seen this year is that both the private sector and the public sector have come together, and, even though they may not be working together so much, they are both concurrently trying to spend a significant amount of money in expanding fiber to the home across the country. So just with that, I think that 2022 really has been a leaping off point for a lot of companies. You're seeing a lot of new entrants into the market. You're seeing a lot of large investment houses that are trying to invest significant amounts of money into the market. And you're seeing the government recognizing that, hey, there's a lot of unserved areas that we recognize that the public sector, the private sector may not be able to fund. The business model may not work. So you're starting to see now the government stepping in as well and saying, okay, we've got some grants to put out there so that we can expand. So I think what we're starting to see right now is the private sector money is flowing. It's flowing well. I think the public sector money, it's slow, like it tends to be on the front end of a lot of the big programs that are out there. But you can start to see the applications that are going out, the people that are trying to apply to get the funds. So as far as what's really working, I think what's working is the kickoff to what is going to be, in my mind, a 5 to 10 year wave of construction of new infrastructure across the country where we need it. So
I would add on to that and say that I think starting beginning of COVID, and especially now with the infrastructure law, that there's a lot more public awareness, right? We kind of had our private companies, our public companies who are in the space, obviously aware of what's going on, but I think the general public is now kind of more aware. I remember starting this and had friends who would say, "What's broadband?" Right? It wasn't kind of in the public mind, but I would say certainly now, between recognizing the great need for it that came from COVID, along with this huge influx of funding going towards it, it's certainly become much more front and center in the public mind, in the media, in the news, which I think is a good thing, because it means we have more action being taken and more work being done to bridge that digital divide.
Yeah, you don't often hear, yes, government involvement is really great.
And I mean, there's hiccups, there's growing pains, there's, for NTIA, who got a lot of this funding, the vast majority of it, they haven't really had that much experience in this before. And I think we've seen that from even last year when they first came out with their broadband infrastructure program. Between that and what they expected from the middle mile, I mean, it was like two different programs. It looked like two different agencies had put it out. And so clearly they learned a lot.
So what's not working is the fact that probably the people that have worked with these organizations have never had to deal with the amount of money and distribution process that they've in their lifetimes, probably.
No. And unfortunately, a lot of the people who are reviewing these grants don't have the industry background, even from engineering, basic engineering. We had a review of an application we put in where they came back and asked us to explain what an access point was. And for us, that's broadband 101, but you then have people in grants writing out what an access point is, and that's something that you would expect a reviewer to know, and it then just prolongs this process of this back and forth, and then the money takes longer to get to folks, and could be a big long drawn out thing because of that learning curve.
I guess Duke and Alex, I mean, from your guys' perspective on the build and project side, I mean, are you seeing from an expansion perspective people that same problem where they don't have the background, they don't have the broadband experience that maybe it'd be nice to have when they're in this phase?
I'd say, back when we were doing some rural stuff back in Iowa, there was always a learning curve when it came to educating not only the public, but also the municipal entities on exactly what broadband infrastructure was going to be. Nowadays, especially like Duke said, because of COVID, the expectation of broadband now is so extreme that there's not so much that I have to explain it to you, more of I have to justify the amount of time frame it's going to take to be able to implement what it is that they're looking for. Everything from the permitting process to materials to labor shortages and everything else all play into the abilities of how fast providers can put some type of network service together and be able to deploy it in a more efficient way. I think we still have a long way to learn, and we have to work out some of these bugs, but we're definitely on the right track.
So, and Alex brought up a good point of, the schedule that it takes to implement networks. That's one thing that I've seen quite a bit over, well, it's a little bit rampant in our industry, and it probably has been for the last 25 years. The expectation for how long it takes to deploy because of permitting, because of materials, because of resources, it's very unpredictable. A little bit differently than if you're building a building in downtown. If I'm building a skyscraper, there are some things that are very predictable. It becomes very unpredictable when you're building in the right of way up and down every single street, because there's so many unknowns that we run into. And that's causing another issue. And this really falls into the what's not working. And again, this is probably something that's been happening for years, but it's really being seen because there's so much expansion. There's a lot of people building business models to that support a fiber to the home network in whatever community in whatever state in the United States right now. Part of that is always an analysis of how long is it going to take to do this, because how long is it going to be before we start providing service to our customers? And I think that is one of the single biggest things that's overlooked when we go into these expansions is how long is it really going to take to build this? And it's causing problems because you've got, board of directors at a lot of these companies looking down at the senior management team saying, you guys are off. Your schedule is off. You guys are not, you were supposed to be serving customers and you're 6 months behind. Well, you're not spending enough time on the front end to recognize that, hey, we've got a lot of material shortages right now across the world. We've got resource problems across the country. You look at where unemployment is right now. And you also got to look at what COVID did to the workforce, especially in our industry. We actually had a fairly aging workforce across the country, but especially in telecom. There were a lot of folks that were right on the verge of retirement age when 2020 happened. And some of them got forced into retirement, and some of them, realized, hey, I probably can retire. So the industry is now having to go through change, and it's going to be problematic for a long time because there is not enough crews to do the work that has to be done. There aren't enough people in the cities to push the permitting through as fast as we need. The other utilities that have stuff in the ground, they don't have enough locators. There's not enough people to just locate the existing gas lines and power lines that are out there today that we have to cross. All of those things factor into the schedule on what it takes to build these networks out. And it's not just as simple as, hey, throw 50 more people out there and see what happens and see how fast we can go. Because there's factors that the manpower in itself is not going to fix. So from a, I guess, Meg, to that point, Megan, from a funding perspective, do you think, obviously, if we asked, do all the government entities that came up with the funding, do they understand what Duke just said? Probably not.
Yeah, well, and it's funny because when you saw last year grants coming out, everything had a 1 year completion timeline, and everyone just laughed. And of course, we all said, like, sure, 1 year, because you're not going to say no, we can't do it and not get money. And there's always, once you are awarded, you communicate with them about delays and they understand. But just the expectation that they were like, do it in 1 year, and we all laughed. And now we're seeing a longer timeline, but, I think the conversation that often we're hearing is about, actual materials, but totally what Duke said about resources. And I actually was going to almost interrupt and be like, what about human resources? But you got there. Because I think that is a huge issue. And I would love to see more collaboration between granting agencies. So I know Department of Labor has a grant for community colleges that I believe we had passed along to Bonfire, who had then passed along to another organization in Colorado who's now working with a community college to get money to put together a fiber technician program. So there's money out there for it, but it's not widely known, right? So I think people are seeing this as an issue, and then they kind of just stop there, right? Like, I think it would be great if the funding agencies that do broadband work were able to say, hey, look at all these other organizations that can help you with this thing that we all know is a problem, instead of just being like, yeah, it's a problem, right?
Do you think that
We
these
all know it is.
agencies
So
are,
it's what action can we take? And there is money for it, but right, it's if you're not active in the grant world, you might not know it's there.
Yeah, and the other thing about that is regarding the training of technicians. You know, I was on a panel a couple of months ago and we were talking about this, and the technician part, there's a shortage there, like there's a shortage everywhere. But there's actually something that's way more unskilled than that. And I say unskilled, like when you look at pure construction crews, there are many entry-level positions that somebody fresh out of high school with zero relevant experience can walk in on day one, get a job, spend some training, get some on the job training, and become a laborer on a directional bore crew or a plow crew or whatever crew. The problem, honestly, is just literally the number of people that are available to fill those types of spots. They're just not there. And you know, construction in general tends to have fairly high turnover anyway. But you start to look at that and you're getting these kids fresh out of school that, hey, you're ready to go to work. We've got a job for you. We can't get those guys the same way we used to, you know, 10 or 15 years ago. I look back and it was, you could go into, we used to recruit out of high schools. You go meet the local high school football coach, figure out which one of his guys aren't going to go to college next year, and you offer him a job. You bring 4 or 5 guys out. You got a crew. It's hard to get that today because
it's just, do you know what the obstacle in that is, right? Because that's something we have people ask us is like, how do we do better? And you know,
well, it's
how do we get that?
It's not one. It is absolutely not one thing. I mean,
Yeah.
you can look at it and say, well, the wages that people are looking for is not isn't there. Well, I can tell you that's changed a lot. I look at some of the entry level positions, and you know, some of those positions have gone up 20-30% or even more in the last year and a half. So you know, some of that's been fixed. That will kind of fix itself. It has to. But
Yeah.
it's there's a certain amount of there's some cultural issues that we have. Is that there's a lot of people that believe, hey, if you don't go to college, you're not going to get a good job, and it's just not true. I mean, I know plenty of people. I've worked for people in the past that they didn't have college education, but they were great. They were great managers and great leaders, and they came into an industry, learned what they needed to learn, and became management. And that can absolutely happen. But until we start to teach kids in high school and in junior high that, hey, you don't have to go to college. You can go into a trade, become a tradesman, and you can be a foreman on a construction crew. And that is a great living to have. And it's, you know, you can provide for your family and have a great time. And, you know, there's a significant number of people that love that. They love working outside every day.
It's interesting if you think about, you know, broadband expansion and just, you know, zooming back out for a second, like that's a great point that like these people can be part of something bigger. And I think when we think of broadband expansion, you know, we obviously talk a lot about fiber, we talk about all these things, but they're really behind the scenes of, you know, like a lot of things in our lives, right? You know, how did the beer get to the store, right? Like, I mean, it is the same thing with the fiber network, right? There are people, you have to have construction people, you have to have all layers from the funding to the construction, to the design, to the project management, to all that I think probably the general consumer and even probably maybe the government people that are giving out funding don't quite understand.
I would say that I think that, you know, some sort of, and I am not the person to implement this, I'm very bad at social media, but some sort of, you know, public awareness campaign targeting those people in high school. And I will say I do tend to see, and I think probably because of student loans, people saying, why do I need to go to college? Like, I'm just going to put myself, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars into debt. But I think then there's that missing piece of connecting. I'm not going to go to college because it's too expensive. And what are my other options? So kind of like what Duke is saying, like just, you know, there are amazing options in these industries, but, you know, there's just not that awareness. So I think we're heading towards people not looking as keenly towards college. But again, then there's that gap between, okay, well then what?
So Alec, I'm curious
again,
on that.
I don't know like social media well enough to get people aware of that, but
I'm curious
Duke and
on
Alex probably do.
On the military side, like, you know, when we talked a lot about all these different components, like what are there different angles that people need to be thinking about or knowing about that's different when you're dealing with, you know, military installations or government facilities?
Well, I'd say, you know, there's definitely differences to it, but just to speak back to what Duke was talking about, I am a product of coming out of the military with only one skill set, having to use my GI Bill to change myself to an IT and a networking field, use my skill sets from the military to climb up the ladders from the different telecom experiences that I've had, and I've become a product. I do not have a formal college degree in this, and so I think in addition to being able to reach out to the high school component of it, there definitely should be a reach out to retiring and separating military, because it's not so much learning the skill sets that's as big important to me in my leadership and what I teach, as it is the moral guidance, the work ethic, the ability to get it done whenever the circumstances require it, putting safety as the first thing. All those traits become very important to me when I'm hiring, and especially when we're trying to teach the next generation of telecom leaders and professionals for us. I think that's always been a big component. You know, I served most of my military time as a medic, but I have made a huge career change being into this industry, and so many other different service groups could benefit from the ability to have the transfer between the two. As far as being able to work in a military facility, having that background has hugely facilitated our abilities to make things happen where we've needed to and be able to get some success where we needed to. We're not quite there yet, but we are getting ground every day.
There's probably like a level of trust, right, between facilities and having that military background.
Absolutely.
And there are really good programs in place today, like the Hiring Our Heroes program that's out there. That's a great program that really pulls people out of the military into different industries. I know that I've used that in the past, and it is a great program. I mean, I've for years I've loved hiring ex-military guys because they've been trained very well, and you know they're always there. They always show up on time. They're there in the morning. So there's general skill sets that you know sometimes you don't get out of hiring the kids out of high school, but you can get, you know, somebody's gone through some military. There's some discipline that comes out of there, and it's great to have those folks.
So let's shift topics a little bit, and what I'm labeling as funding fun versus funding frustration. So as we joked a little bit earlier, you know, the timeline for some of this stuff is dragged out immensely. Megan, what are we seeing? Like, is there I guess, you know, are there some highlights? Are there some fun things that we see happening on the funding side that are going to maybe help alleviate some of this frustration and consternation of getting that money to the places it needs to go?
I mean, I would say the fun thing, right, is anytime someone gets an award, you know. And
several happened this week, by the way. So
there have been some in the past few weeks, absolutely, and some that LDA has been able to assist with, and I know that Bonfire assisted with as well. So those are always fun to see, and I would say there's often a fun aspect of seeing what people come up with, right? I think different places can sometimes require really unique solutions. It's not, you know, broadband isn't a one size fits all kind of deal. And seeing some of these, I know what?
I totally thought that's what everybody says. It's cookie cutter, right?
Wild. No, and so sometimes it's fun seeing these ideas that people come up with, and especially when it comes to digital equity, kind of seeing the thoughts and the programs that people are putting together. So that's always fun. I'd say the biggest frustration is the timelines. And I don't know that government is ever going to move any faster than they do. It seems like wishful thinking, and, you know.
But here's something that's funny about that. You talk about the timelines and the funding and the frustration from the government. I can tell you that the private sector in this situation is not moving much faster. I've been telling people this for a while, is that, you will 2 weeks yourself for a year. Is everything? Yep, everything's going to be ready. We're 2 weeks out, and I've literally seen projects that were 2 weeks out for an entire year. Every 2 weeks, it's something new, because hey, the funding's coming. We talk to the banks, we talk to the investors, and everybody's ready to go. They're ready to sign it. We've got the term sheets in place. We've all agreed to it, but you get 2 weeks for a year, and that's not an exaggeration, Joe. So even though we always tend to bash the government, and then always think that the private sector is better, they're not always better. And this is one situation where there's
really bureaucracy in both sectors.
there's bureaucracy. You can't escape it. I'd say one of the things that I
merge them. That's always fun too.
Yeah.
Well,
I guess to that point, though, I mean, maybe
you got to manage expectations, and I preach that quite often in a lot of fronts. But this is definitely one where you can't let the states and the communities think that this is coming next week, because it is not coming next week.
But I guess on that point, I mean, like, how do you tell somebody? I mean, at the end of the day, the end customer for this, the end benefactor is the consumer, right? It is, or in business as well. But like, how do you tell somebody who is struggling, as we talked about in the very beginning, to just get basic access to the things that a lot of other people have? How do you tell them, sorry, it's going to be 2 years? Like, I mean, it's not a great message, right?
And I'll be honest, I don't know that there's an answer to that, Nick. It's as simple as it's going to take some time. I mean, there's just too much to be done.
So is part of this, we need to better explain, I mean, the benefits of fiber are amazing, clearly. So like, is it a part of, we need to do collectively a better job of like, yes, it's going to take time, but at the end, this is what you get.
I think, sorry, was I answering Duke's question?
No.
Rock on.
I was just so excited to say something. I think, and it is a hard thing to say, like, sorry, this isn't going to get to you. And it is managing the expectation, giving the awareness and education of it. But I think there's also room for some stopgaps, right? If you have a community that you don't have fiber to the home, and but you've got public libraries that have computers that can be used for telehealth. What sort of money can you get for a small minibus to schedule for people to go have a telehealth appointment when they need it, right? Well, there's kind of stopgaps. Like, it's not ideal, and there's some communities that, I mean, there's nothing. But
you hit on something too that's kind of important too, is that we're right now talking about fiber to the home, so that everybody has it at their house. But if you look at the history of telecom, especially over the last 25 years, you start to see a development of how the networks across the United States were built. You go back in the early 90s, I mean, even more than that, 30 years, you start looking and you start to see that, okay, there were major long haul routes that had to get built so you could connect, Chicago and New York City. So a lot of that was happening in the 80s and 90s. Well, then we got into the big cities. So all the NFL cities in the mid to late 90s, those started getting built out. You were building these big rings in downtown Denver and downtown San Francisco. And that kind of got all built out in the early, the late 90s, early 2000s. And then things slowed down for a little while. And you kind of started to overbuild different things. And fiber to the home, there's been kind of test beds over the last 20 years of different places that have been built. But when you really dive into what's been happening in the last couple of years, the last 5 to 10 years, there's actually been a change in what was happening. And this is relevant. I'll get to that point. But you go back 10 years and everybody saw that 5G was coming. We didn't even know 10 years ago, we didn't even know what 5G looked like. But you start going to 2017 and you start looking at some of the huge deployments that were going on around across the country, like what Verizon was doing specifically. they were building out a significant number of NFL cities, the big cities. And then they started to go down to some of the smaller towns, not small towns, but smaller, markets like Omaha and places like that weren't quite as big, Albuquerque. But you started to see that, okay, they're building this out, getting ready for 5G. But then, like we talked about, COVID happened and the 5G push kind of slowed a little bit, as opposed to where the fiber to the home push was going. So the problem with all of that is that telecom's not been built out consistently since its inception. So there's always a different push. And right now we really do have two pushes going on with and any one of them would make for a busy industry. The 5G push is still here. There's still a huge push. And what 5G, everybody thinks, 5G, that's all going to be wireless. We're not going to need fiber. It's actually opposite of that. We need more fiber because of the 5G, because all those antennas need fiber to them. That push is still happening, but it's happening at the same time that there's a huge fiber to the home push, which either of those in itself would make for an industry that's as busy as it's ever been. So you combine those two with, the shortages and resources, whether it be manpower, whether it be materials, it's causing an issue. Then on top of all of that, you've got the significant amount of money that both the private and the public sector are trying to dump into the industry. So it's pushing all of those things forward all at the same time. It's a great time to be in our industry because there's so much money in it. Everybody's trying to spend money. But the problem is, with the amount of money, with the amount of push, it's just you can't get it all done in the time frame that people are thinking, because you got to take the whole picture. Look at everything that's happening in the industry.
So do you think, I guess on that note, do you think all of this has actually helped drive technology, like drive advancements in deploying broadband and any wireless, fiber, everything? Has this massive expansion effort actually helped propel us forward in the technology space?
Well, if you think about where we've come from just 9 years ago when Google Fiber announced their gigabit symmetrical service in Kansas City in 2013 to now, we have XGS-PON and capabilities of doing 10 gig symmetrical in different capacities. Providers are even looking, in commercial applications at 50 and 100 gig applications. So we've already made huge strides in bandwidth needs and also bandwidth capabilities. I remember at the beginning of the inception of Google Fiber, we couldn't even come up with enough reasons to have a gig, but we all wanted it. Now I'm at the
Game of Thrones streaming constantly now.
Well, it's at the same time now, it's like, if 10 gigs of capability, what in the world am I doing that with? But then you start to put together that so much of our worlds are out interconnected. And just like Duke was alluding to, the two different sides of this, the wireline fiber side and the 5G wireless component of this, are now competing for attention and competing for infrastructure. And that's it, like you said, it's great and exciting for our industry, but it's nerve-wracking in trying to deliver the timelines and the expectations that our public demands.
I feel like a lot of the 10G stuff is probably coming. It's already in existence with the military. We just don't know what it is.
I have no news on
You're not allowed to know.
Yeah.
We'd have to kill you if we knew, right?
Alex knows, but he can't tell us.
Well, believe me, they don't tell me much, and they wouldn't want to.
So the interesting thing, though, is you look at the technology, at Alex's point on the technology on what services can provide. There have been advancements on the construction side as well for deployments. And the biggest one, honestly, is microtrenching. And I can tell you that I've been involved with microtrenching for many years, and for a long time, back in the early 2000s, when those things were really first getting developed. I remember talking to people that were asking about microtrenching, and I was very much an opponent of it because I saw some of the issues that we were going to have with it. Well, it is becoming more widely accepted. I would by no means say it is widely accepted, and I would also by no means say it's the solution that's going to push things forward, but it is yet another tool that we didn't have, back in the 90s and the early 2000s to really deploy. And there's still a lot of cities that aren't going to allow it. But again, it is something that we can use that may help with some of this deployment and help speed some things up. I mean, Google Fiber is probably the biggest, one of the biggest proponents of it, because they've been doing that in a lot of markets, and it's getting fiber to the home into these markets fairly quickly. I mean, as quickly as you can expect, but it is by no means a magic wand, and it didn't solve all the problems, but it is another tool to use. So that technology has been advancing, and as that construction techniques gets older and older, we're starting to see certain things that really allow it to possibly be accepted more widely across the country. So there are things on the construction side too that are pushing technology, not just the technology on the for the services.
Are there any other, I guess, wins from the technology perspective that have come out of all this that you guys are seeing on the horizon that are coming up that are going to help? And then I guess kind of connecting the dots, like should, when you're trying to get funding, should we be trying to insert, hey, we're going to do this technology, it's new, it's better, it's faster, please fund me?
Well, I can definitely speak to the material changes that we've seen, the advancements in microduct technology and the way our networks are now being deployed is significantly better for the overall longevity of the network, future-proofing, weather considerations that have been coming. Climate change is becoming a more and more considerate factor when it comes to our deployments. Break fix, maintenance are huge elements when it comes to what we're doing, especially when you're picking a market or you're trying to develop in a particular area, going off of the existing infrastructure versus designing brand new. The one thing I can definitely say from what I call the old days back when we were building, Kansas City to what we're doing now, it blows my mind how much better our technology is and our materials and our capabilities of getting in the ground once, but still being able to utilize extra conduit and extra facilities for future options and future technologies, things that we could never predict in the past. We have a lot more opportunities now to build on and increase that ability. And that's really made a difference as well. We're not just building for the next 10 years, we're really building for the next 20 and 30 years. And I do see that as being a significant change as these different municipalities, small towns, larger towns, they really start to understand that this is bigger than just a brand new cable in the ground. This is a brand new system that's going to enhance a lot of what we want to put off in the long-term future for us.
I think it's interesting to Dirk's earlier comment that, which is not talked about a lot, that this is the build of this is not a 1 year, 2 year. It is a 5, 10 year, like it's a longer term view, which I think, again, we're a very soundbite type of people, and it's hard to think that far out, but that's an interesting point. Building for the future.
Well, and I do think a lot of people that are putting in for the grants have recognized that. And they're putting in, we're also enabling 5G. There's a few people, probably not a lot right now, but they're also enabling IoT, whatever IoT really turns into, because IoT has become this catch-all for the smart things that we all use, whether it be in our house, whether it be smart city stuff. It all becomes this catch-all for what is IoT. And I know at Bonfire, we've been doing some research with, what is IoT going to be? What's it going to mean for us? But I think what we've got to be able to do is try to plan for that as much as you can, whether that be building an excess capacity and all those things. Because that's something that you're starting to see in a few of the older communities with fiber to the home. And I say older, like Kansas City, as much as it's a new network, it's one of the older ones. You take Chattanooga, Tennessee, you take Lafayette, Louisiana, who's had their networks for 10 years now, or almost 10 years. You start to look at it. And one conversation that we were having 10 years ago was, okay, we're going to empower people to consume more. And it's all, I think everybody has accepted that, at least has had this conversation, that the first thing you do when you build a broadband network is you empower somebody to consume more content. You're watching more videos online, you're streaming more videos, you're doing more things. But what is going to be interesting is the long-term impacts. And what the long-term impacts are going to be is, what else can we do to become producers and not just consumers? fiber to the home is going to be able to, it's going to push us there to what can you do now that you have the bandwidth, not just that you got a gigabit down, but you got a gigabit up. What if you're streaming more things? So you start to see that. That's the whole evolution of what the technology is going to take us to. And we have to be able to see that. And I don't know that it's, I don't know how many studies are even been done on it, but when you start to consider what happens after we've just created the consumers and we start to create producers in these markets, what does that do for the economy? What does it do for the tax base? I mean, we can start to see some of those things now with, hey, Google and some of the other Silicon Valley companies recognize, hey, their workforce can be remote. There's plenty of people that love to live in the middle of Wyoming, but they don't have the bandwidth to work for their company that's in Silicon Valley. They can do that now. So you're starting to see a little bit of that happen, but we're on the very front edge of that. And I really think that's going to push things a lot further. And I think it's actually going to be really good for rural America of all places.
I think the other piece of that is, into the IoT piece, is we have an aging population, right? So there's a lot of people that are, in retirement age, and the ability to stay in their homes, right? Having technology that allow you to age in place, so to speak, right? Not have to, be able to be monitored remotely. To your point, I want to live somewhere out that's not in a big city, but I need to be able to be monitored by my family or my children or whatever. Like you need broadband, you need access to do that kind of stuff. So
I would say, in that absolutely agencies want to fund this kind of thing. I mean, you look at what the requirements are on a lot of these grants. It's how are you future proofing? Like, what are you thinking about for the future? And what are you thinking about for the climate, right? How are you going to account for global heating? So I don't think that would stop any funding agency from funding an application, especially if you're proposing something new, right? If they're saying, yeah, this is going to be a great investment because, here's what they're saying it can do. Here's some backup evidence that they have,
So how much pie in the sky should they be there? Like, is it a good idea from a grant perspective to try to be very future forward and like, hey, I can do all these things with IoT? Does that help?
I mean, I think you have to be practical about it, right? And you have to both think
not the
future.
Jetsons so much.
I mean, you have to think for the future and address the current need, right? You can't just say we're building for something that is whatever IoT might be, and not address like, hey, this aging population needs telehealth right now, right? So again, that's kind of where grant writing comes in, is how are you phrasing your project? How are you presenting it? How are you thinking it through? And then
a lot of this is building the infrastructure for that, though. A lot of it is, because even though we may not be talking about or installing all of the IoT devices, the simple fact of the matter is, until there's infrastructure in place to support that, we can't even really, you can't deploy any of that stuff. So the bulk of the cost in all of these is building the infrastructure. So you've got to equate this back to, the electrification of America back in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. It's the same thing. We're going through it again. And even when even when the phone companies were originally put in the old telephone lines, it's the same thing. We're going through it again. It's just a technology that has to be installed.
Yeah, I think what we see as kind of one of the big concerns is kind of what Alex was saying, though, with how resilient is this going to be? How are you accounting for weather? Because that's a huge thing, right? We have a lot of applications that we do that are for clients who have either been affected by huge storms, by hurricanes, by wildfires, and it's a consideration, especially if government's going to be investing a large amount of money. How are you making sure that's not going to waste, right? Are you going to put aerial and tornado, valley, which I feel like it's tornado country now. Tornadoes.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's not really valley anymore.
It's always fire season. It's always tornado spots.
It's always hurricane season.
It's always hurricane season. There's no seasons anymore. But are you addressing that? And so I think that's kind of definitely, they want to see how are you,
I think that probably goes to the point of why grant writing and folks like you guys are important, right? I think there is there's a nuance to like what you need to be thinking about. If you really, if a company or a community wants to get funding, you got to ask in the right way.
Absolutely.
Well, guys, it's hard to believe we've already flown by almost an hour conversation. So I'd like to always we'd like to wrap with kind of a parting thought from each of you in this, and it can be whatever you think that the broadband people that love what we do want to hear about. So I guess just kind of a parting thought on broadband expansion in general, and where do you think we're going? And we'll start with Duke.
All right. Well, thanks, Nick. So I've said most of my pieces, but honestly, I've been in this industry pretty much my entire career, and I'm excited for where the industry is. Like I've said, I think we are on the very front edge of a wave that's coming. And I say the front edge, we've kind of been in this for 4 or 5 years. The industry's been busy. Nobody that's been trying to build telecom networks is struggling to find work today. And you're not going to for the next 5 to 10 years. Obviously there's things like the economy, you got to worry about economy collapse and those kind of things. But in general, we know what's needed. This is infrastructure. It's infrastructure in the same way that, roads are infrastructure, power is infrastructure, your water lines are infrastructure. This is the infrastructure that needs to be in place across the country. And everyone needs it. It's not just some homes. It's not just the communities where people may be working remote. It is everybody. And there are significant portions of this country that are unserved or underserved. And we need to get the infrastructure in place to get broadband there, because it really becomes a quality of life issue. It becomes an economy and real estate issue. It just touches everything. So, I'm excited to be in the industry right now because of all that. I mean, it's a great, I guess I picked a great time to be in this industry, because we know that there's people spending money, and that's a great thing for everyone that's in our industry, because we know that there's going to be funding. We know that things have to get built. And so that's exciting for all of us. And we should all be excited for it, because it allows for us to do some things we weren't able to do years ago. So
it's funny if you think about the word infrastructure has become, that would have never been in the common vernacular 3 or 4 years ago, right? But it is evolved. So, all right, Alex.
I would definitely agree with Duke. We have a lot of amazing things, and this is a great time to be in the industry. But at the same time, I would also remind ourselves to pay attention to history and remember the lessons that we've learned. With climate change and the changing weathers and different things, our future-proofing thought process and our designs have to take that into consideration when we're designing our networks. We have to be building the better structure instead of the faster structure, because lessons have been learned and been more than one deployment. Just like Duke said, I worked for a telephone company that existed for 113 years, and down in the basement was still the original ether torches from when they connected the original copper wires to the towers back in 1913, 1914. So those lessons have to be observed. We have we have all kinds of different types of municipalities and homing in residential areas that are desperate for services. Do not be fooled by fly-by-night, unfunded, unsubstantiated companies that may not necessarily know what they're doing when it comes to building these things. We are looking for the long term when it comes to our infrastructures, and unlike traditional copper plants, fiber doesn't repair quite as easy. So that's something we have to take into consideration. Other than that, it is an extremely exciting time for us. We are venturing into some new areas that we never thought we'd get into, and are seeing huge results in what that's going to look like. So I'm excited as well.
Awesome. And last but not least, Mrs. Money, Megan.
Gosh, I wish everyone put me into their grants to get me all that money, but I mean, I think the money's going where it's important. And what I always find encouraging on these podcasts is the people talking, right? And that recognizing these issues and taking action, right? So Alex, taking action about what is a huge concern with the environment. And that's always encouraging. And, Duke, you talking about, your veteran program, right? Addressing the workforce through that. And these are issues that the industry is facing. And it's always so heartening for me to see people in the industry addressing them, right? Instead of just saying, oh yeah, this is an issue and sitting back, right? People like Duke and Alex actually addressing the workforce issue, the environment issue, because it is on us in the industry doing the work to make sure that things are done right, that we have the people, that we're growing the talent, that we're addressing these environmental concerns. And I think hopefully whoever watches this can take a card or a page out of their books and look at how you can make the industry better that you're in, because we need to. There is this money, and it's on us to make sure that it's spent right and that it's invested in the right way.
Well said. And an industry is made up of people, right? And the people are the ones that can make a difference for both now and in the future. So, well, all of you, let's raise your beers. Again, thank you for being on this episode of Beer and Broadband. To all of your respective companies. Obviously, you can see Duke at bonfire-ec.com. You can go to Boingo Wireless, learn, design, apply. Thank you all for being here. You can catch us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. And until next time, happy Oktoberfest. Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. Prost.
Prost.